Hi, everybody. This is Alan Soldofsky. I'm the MFA Program Director at San Jose State University. And welcome to this special program for the Legacy of Poetry, Staying Home, The Way to San Jose webcast. We are going to bring you an interview with the poet Ellen Bass, whose new book, Indigo, has just been published by Copper Canyon Press. You can go to the Copper Canyon Press website and find Ellen Bass there. And at the bottom of her Indigo page, there are two boxes that you can click to purchase copies of the book. The one on the left gets you to a bunch of indie sites, just so that you know. The book is in bookstores if you can get to a bookstore. So we're very glad, Ellen, to welcome you to join us. And I will also let everyone know that Ellen Bass will be teaching at San Jose State in the spring of 2021, teaching the graduate poetry workshop as the Lurie Distinguished Visiting Author in Residence. So we're very glad to have you join us in that way. I'm also being joined by Rachel Crawford, who is an MFA student at San Jose State. She's an award-winning poet herself. And she is going to join me and perhaps lead me in the questions that we're giving to Ellen Bass. So Ellen, good morning, glad to see you.
Good morning, I'm very happy to be here with you all.
So Rachel, good to see you.
Good to see you too, Alan, and thank you for being here, Ellen.
Oh, my pleasure, Rachel.
And Rachel, thank you for all the preparation that you did for this. I just thought, you know, Rachel and I will kind of go back and forth asking you things and see where the conversation goes. But we're going to really be focusing on Indigo since some of us are going to be teaching it next year in preparation for you joining us. I've been interested in how you put the book together because the tone of the book seems to be a little bit different than that of your last book, Like a Beggar. And I'm wondering, just in terms of you creating these poems, what was the time span were you working on this book? And for you, Ellen, how have the poems changed from your previous collection?
It's about 6 years that I worked on this book. My last book, Like a Beggar, came out in 2014. And this came out in 2020. So it's the things that I was thinking about, the things that I was experiencing during this time. It feels to me like each successive book emerges out of the last one, that the subjects that I've handled, I'm handling them often again, but in another phase of my life. And also the world continues forward in that way. During the writing of this book, my wife went through a very difficult time, and so there's one arc through this book of my experience, not so much her experience, but mine as her partner. And other things were happening. My mother-in-law, who I was very close to, was going into dementia and then dying. My dog was getting old and dying. And so there were life events. My son was living at home again while he went to graduate school, and he was falling in love. So there was, you know, life and death and love and illness and passion, and also the world around us, which, as we know, is in a critical time. And there's always that pull between praising the world that we do have and elegy for what we're losing. So there were a lot of tensions in this book.
So there are moments of levity. The book, in general, the poems seem a little darker. than in like
Yeah.
in poems in Like a Beggar.
Yes. Yes. Indeed.
But the one I sort of noticed just early on is in the book, you have a poem, you know, like many of your more light poems, takes something domestic and rather banal and turns it into a kind of a metonymic subject. And you did one for the pork chop.
Yes.
And I know, like you, like me, you come from a Jewish background. I was a little surprised to see a Jewish poet write an ode to a pork chop.
Well, gosh, so many things I could say about that. Growing up, we did not eat pork chops and we did not eat ham. Those were goyishe. But we did eat bacon. We loved bacon. So, you know, this is true of many Jews. I think it must be true of many cultures that assimilate. There are certain things that seem like, okay, we can go with bacon, but the idea of cooking a ham, that was just completely something. I was in college before I ever saw even a ham, and we were served in the cafeteria ham and cabbage, and it was so good. It was like, oh, where has this been all my life? You know, I have been eating bacon, but so it's I think I've come so far from there. That's a very long time ago. And this pig that it was pork chop I write about, was raised by friends of ours. And so we were very familiar with the raising of this pig. We felt very good about the way that it was raised. We felt that this pig had had a good life, that it wasn't a factory farmed pig. And then we got to eat this pork chop, which really was the best pork chop I've ever had.
Right. That explains the reference in the middle of the poem. I don't know if you have the text there, but you could read, you know, a few lines from it. You know, where you mention, not necessarily the whole poem, but where you mention the pig, the happy pig.
Yes, yes. So I say, everything you do will cause harm, so I start forgiving myself now. And this pig was a happy pig, and his death, though death, was good.
Yeah. So maybe, you know, we can find something in a dark subject. I mean, I'm thinking about the time we're living in now, which is kind of, we're not going to mention it that much since we're talking about poetry, but it sort of sits on top of us because we couldn't have our program in front of a live audience as we had originally planned to for Legacy of Poetry. We're doing this virtually. We're doing a recording. So everything that we're doing as poets is in some ways penetrated by the facts of our circumstances. And one goes to the grocery store and buys pork chops. I mean, you didn't for this dinner, but one goes with a certain amount of fear, trepidation. Isn't that right?
Oh, we're all living with this deep anxiety, with this deep sorrow that is so new and so profound that for myself, and I'm sure for many people, we haven't even begun to really absorb all of that. And poetry is there for us in the hardest times. In my last book, the epigraph was from Rilke, and he says, "Oh, tell us, poet, what do you do? I praise, but those dark, deadly, devastating ways, how do you suffer them, bear them? I praise."
So you've done that in Indigo as well. I know Rachel has a couple of follow-ups to what we're talking about. So, but you do praise difficult circumstances and still find a certain way of coping that adds an enriching substance to life.
Well, that's the idea. That's why I write, is to try to find a way to hold my experience as part of the human experience, and to not resist our lives. That's what is so easy to fall into, but is a terrible trap. And so our life, what it is what it is. That the Buddhist teacher Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche said, I might not be saying this exactly, but it's something like, if you can hold all the pain of the world in your heart and still see the vastness of the great eastern sun, then you can make a proper cup of tea.
He's the founder of the Naropa
Yes.
University, and was a mentor and teacher for Allen Ginsberg.
Yes.
Did you know Trungpa?
No, I didn't.
Yeah. Have you taught at Naropa?
No.
Maybe that's in your future.
I find that very interesting.
Yeah.
If anyone from Naropa is interested in having me come, just shoot me an email.
we knew Joanne Kiger very well, and she was often teaching at Naropa. The program's still led by Ann Waldman.
Yes.
Put in a word after you're done with us.
I won't go before, I promise.
Rachel, you were going to follow up a little.
Well, Ellen, you said, that making the cup of tea, and that's such a lovely image. And thinking back to the pork chop, and then the epigraph in your previous collection about praise. And there are so many poems in this Indigo collection that have food in them, and there is this praise of food, and I love that. And I just wanted to hear some of your thoughts about writing about food, because I think that the taste and the smell imagery could be some of the most difficult to write. So how do you navigate writing about food?
Well, I think to me, what is striking about my personal experience writing about food is that for years I wanted to write about food and have food come into my poems, and there was no food. And I kept, you know how when you're just sort of hoping that something will start to enter, or that you'll have a portal somehow into what you want to do. And so for years I just kept kind of asking the muse, could you just throw me a little food for my poems? And then once somehow that door got opened, and I really don't know how it got opened except by wanting it. And I think what we want, we put our attention to. And so I was putting my attention there more and more. And then it started to yield. It started to be interested. And I think also that I began thinking more about our food supply, how meat is raised, how organic gardening. My wife is an entomologist, and she worked, she's retired now, but she worked with farmers to grow crops using predator insects to control pest insects rather than using chemicals. So she worked in crops that had high chemical toxicity, like strawberries and cotton. And so I was always thinking about food and how we grow our food. And then my son was an organic farmer for a number of years. So, and they're both really good cooks. And my son was living with us during most of the time, or maybe not most, maybe half of the time that I was writing this book. So there was a lot of cooking going on. And I'm not a cook. The first poem in this book is called Sous Chef, and I am a superb sous chef because I'm competent and I can take directions and I have no opinion. And that's what every chef wants, is a sous chef who can do it, but does not start to tell them, oh, don't you think you should do a little bit more of this? So no, I don't ask any questions. I just want to be told what to do, and then I do it. So there's a lot of talk about food in our house. And sometimes it seems that that's all we talk about. And we'll be eating one wonderful meal, and we'll be talking about the other wonderful meals that we've had and the ones that we want to make. So I think I've just been more immersed in food and the growing of food and the dangers of food. In my last book, it began, and in this one, it just really took off.
Now you mentioned Chef is the first poem in the collection. Why did you put that first? Is there something you're wanting to lead your readers toward, some message or some theme in that specific poem that pulls us through the rest of the collection?
Thank you for that question. I actually didn't know that that should be the first poem myself until I was talking with the wonderful poet Jericho Brown, who was kind enough to help me look at some of these poems and especially talk to me about the order of the poems. And he gave me some guidance that it was just incredibly helpful. And then he said, this is your first poem because this is a kind of ars poetica. And I didn't even know that. Sometimes we don't even know what's in our own poems. And I went, really? Are you sure? And he went, oh, absolutely, I'm absolutely sure. And then once I put it there, I could see it immediately. But I don't think I ever would have been able to see it on my own.
I'm wondering, in terms of the order, you have a poem also that includes a lot of food, but it has a slightly different tone than Sous Chef, which, yeah, it does seem like an ars poetica. But it's a poem that I would have expected to come later in the book, and it comes early, and that's the one, Enough, that begins with the Rimbaud quote, enough seen, enough had, enough. Because I thought of it as maybe when I read things out of order, it was a poem that sort of had a summative quality to it. And could you talk a little bit about that? That's where you're craving more.
Yes, this poem it emerged out of my experience with my mother-in-law, who was moving into dementia. And one of the great surprises of my love life was when Janet, my wife's mother, moved to Santa Cruz, and I thought that would be nice and we could support her. But what I didn't expect was that she and I would just come to love each other so deeply and be so intimate. And it was a great loss as she began to decline. And so I was thinking in this poem a lot about that process and about, this is something that people my age talk about all the time, is how long would you want to live, and where is your bottom line, and when would you rather die rather than go through especially losing your mind. And so the reason that this poem comes early and isn't really a summation is more in my own process, my own life. Is this was coming early, and part of ordering this book is that, like, my dog had to be alive before he died in the book. So the poems in which he's alive have to happen before the poem in which he's dying, and the same thing with my mother-in-law. So there was a kind of chronology that I had to work with, as well as maybe the feeling of the poem. But in this poem, I'm exploring that tension between how strong any animal or plant or anything is to want to keep living. I mean, that's our that's our, basic urge and push forward. And yet, when do you say enough?
Maybe you could you read the last two stanzas of the poem?
Sure. So in this poem, I'm talking, I use an epigraph from Rimbaud. He said, "Enough seen, enough had, enough." And in the poem, I'm talking about my mother-in-law, and also talking about that pull between wanting to live and when it's time to die. And so I say, "And yet, this little hat of life, how will I bear to take it off while I can still reach up? Snug woolen watch cap, lacy bonnet, yellow cloche with a yellow veil. I wore the Easter I turned 13, when my mother let me promenade with Tommy Spagnola on the boardwalk in Atlantic City. Oxygen, oxygen, the cry of the body. But there may come a day when I must say no, enough, enough, with more tenderness than I have ever given to a lover, the gift of the nipple hardening under my fingertip. More tenderness than to my newborn, when I held her still streaked with my blood. I'll say the most gentle refusal to this dear animal, and tighten the clasp around my throat that once was kissed and kissed until the blood could no longer rest in its channel, but rose to the surface like a fish that couldn't wait to be caught."
Well, that's an amazing poem. Thank you for reading that part of it.
Ellen, I have a question about, there's so many autobiographical, or what seems like autobiographical details, and you said that there was a lot going on in your life, and so that's where kind of some of the inspiration came for your poems. And the poet Ocean Vuong, in an interview about his novel, was asked, how much of this is true about you, because it seems like it's about you. And he said, well, I wanted to start with truth and end with art. And so I wanted to ask you about that process of writing autobiographical details, and at what point do you deviate from that to create your art? And also, how do you write about people in your life? Just talk about that process, please.
Sure. I just love what Ocean Vuong said. I want to start with truth and end with art. That is the most concise way and absolutely accurate to put it. So the way that I think about it is that the events of my life and the things in my life are the material that I'm given to work with. And I think about it, I don't know why this image always comes to my mind, but I think about it as if I lived out on a prairie somewhere centuries ago, and there weren't stores, and occasionally a peddler came by in his wagon, or maybe her wagon, and had some bolts of cloth in there, and a very limited number. And if I needed cloth, that's what I could buy. And so I didn't get to just go into a store and choose whatever I wanted. That's what was there for me. And then anything I wanted to make, I had to make it out of those bolts of cloth. So I think about the events of my life as there to be used. And I don't think anyone is really interested in what happens to the poet, or at least not often. Mostly we read poetry to understand something more about ourselves. We read them to see ourselves reflected in some way, or we read them to learn more about humans in general. What about people who are similar to us, about people who are different to us. We read them to kind of enlarge our compassion, both for ourselves and for others. But very rarely, I think, does anyone finish a poem thinking, and then I wonder what happened. So we don't care about the narrative of the poet's life. And I tell my students, nobody cares about what happened to you. And nobody cares about what happened to me. They care about what I can make of it. And does it mean something to them? Does it help them see the world in a different way? Does it help them in a hard time? Does it give them joy or delight? Do they see something? Do they have an insight that they didn't have before? So in that way, I'm every single thing that's in a poem didn't happen exactly that way, but a great deal of it did happen pretty much exactly that way. You know, I really was cooking that pork chop, and my dog really was there, and the pig really did have a happy life. You know, so there's a great deal that's exactly that way, and then there's some where I have to work with it somewhat to make it into a poem. But yes, I'm trying to transform it, and I write about my wife a lot. She is an incredible muse to me. Just this morning, we were taking a walk, and she started telling me about something, and I went, "Oh my God, you know, I mean, if I can write this poem, I don't think I even should take credit for it. You know, it's like, you're just like handing me this." And I think about her sometimes like a cat who brings a mouse and, you know, puts it on your doorstep, only this is the mouse that I really want. And so she inspires a lot of poems. Fortunately, she knew me before we were involved together romantically. We were friends for years before we became lovers, and so she knew what she was getting into, and it was kind of full disclosure. So we didn't go through maybe some of the tension that someone might go through if this had been sprung on them. But she is very generous, and I'm very grateful to her for that generosity. And she doesn't love being in all my poems. She feels like she often doesn't want to come to my poetry readings because she doesn't want people to like look at her and go, "Oh, that's you." But she's very generous, and she knows that this is who I am, and if she wants me, this is it. My children are a different story. I feel that I owe a different ethical responsibility to them, not to exploit them. And I don't publish anything about my children unless they are good with it. And they, I have two children, and it's extremely rare that either one of them says, "I don't want you to publish this." Extremely rare. So they're very generous too, very, very generous. And I really try in my poems about the people who are close to me. I try very hard to write from my experience, not to appropriate their experience. And that's maybe a difficult line because they are somewhat exposed, but I try not to speak for them. I try not to say what things are about for them. I try and say what they're about for me.
Yeah, and it seems that in your writing you do that very well, where it's almost as if you are observing maybe something that they are doing or something that they have said, but you're writing about it always from your perspective. And I'm thinking also of one particular poem that I absolutely love in this collection that is not writing about your family or your wife. It's writing about an entirely different population. And on your website, it says that you founded poetry workshops at Salinas Valley State Prison and the Santa Cruz jails. And I think that it's so wonderful that you bring poetry to a population that is despised by so many, yet they're vulnerable and neglected segment of our population and our society. And you spoke a little bit earlier about writing compassion, and you do that so well in this particular poem, which is titled "Bringing Flowers to Salinas Valley State Prison." And you know, this poem resonated with me because I'm writing a lot of poems about visiting a family member in prison. And so there's just this wonderful image. And in that poem, I don't know if you want to read the whole poem or read a portion of it.
It's a short poem. I'd love to read the whole poem.
Wonderful.
I had the incredible opportunity to begin this poetry workshop at Salinas Valley State Prison. The psychologist at the time was Ben Block, who's the son of Hannah Block. And Hannah is a wonderful poet who passed away not too long ago. And her son, Ben Block, is also a poet and the psychologist in this wing of the prison. And he wanted to start a poetry workshop. And I taught this workshop for a while. And now other poets in the community have continued it. It's been going on, oh gosh, I'm not sure exactly how long, but maybe about 8 years or so now. And then a couple of years ago, with the help of Nancy Miller, I started poetry workshops in the Santa Cruz jails. And of course, right now they're suspended, but we have, and we'll continue to have once we can, I think it's 6 or 7 weekly ongoing workshops in the jails, and one in the library for men and women who are coming out of jail, because that transition out is so difficult too. And it's been a great experience. The men down at Salinas Valley State Prison were so eager for intellectual conversation. And when I went in, I anticipated that they would really want to have their poems heard. They would want self-expression, and of course they did. But I thought that would be like the main thing, somebody to listen to me. But actually, it seems to me that even more, they wanted to be able to discuss things. They wanted to be able to use their minds and grapple with ideas. And they were just as interested in reading poems and studying them as they were in their own self-expression, more so than most of the students that I encounter in writing workshops anywhere else, who are mostly interested in writing their own, how about my poem? But here they were just so excited to talk about poems. And usually when I teach a class, I go in, and especially in the beginning, maybe I'll do a close reading of a poem, and I'll start to talk about of a sample poem, a great poem that I want to share with them. I'll start to talk about what I see happening in the poem, and how different strategies are used in the poem. Here, I couldn't even get a word out before, in that very first class, the men started saying, and look at this metaphor, and look at this image that he ends with, and look at this word that he chose. And they, with no training at all, they just like jumped in and just wanted to eat up that poem. And that's, I didn't mean that as a pun, but as I talk about this, of course there's eating in it, but I didn't mean that. I just do that naturally, and I can't stop myself. So I'm going to read this poem, and this is absolutely true. Bringing Flowers to Salinas Valley State Prison. When Mr. H saw the little meadow blooming on the steel table, he bowed to the starry faces of jasmine. This is the first flower I've smelled in 20 years. And when I slid each man a bouquet in a paper cup, Mr. M said, "I'll have such a short time with these." We spoke then about beauty and loss, the great themes of poetry. And when our time was done, and the guard said they had to leave the flowers, most of the men acquiesced. But Mr. S insisted he had, as a Native American, a right to his rituals: sage, sweet corn, tobacco, and no one could stop him. It was the law, from taking these sacred plants back to his cell. Then he raised his cup and drank the water the flowers were drinking. And a small wind stirred in that windowless room as we watched Mr. S quietly bite the heads off the Peruvian lilies, crushing their pink sepals and the gold inner petals flecked with maroon, swallowing the silvery filaments, their dark, pollen-laden anthers, his mouth frothing with blossoms.
I love that poem. Thank you, Ellen, for reading it.
You know
Thank
that
you, Rachel.
the ending of that poem, I wouldn't call that final image exactly the same kind of epiphany that a poet like James Wright got in
Break into Blossom.
yeah, Breaking the Blossom, but it has that effect. Could you say something about the way you end poems?
Yes, I can. And but first I want to say one more thing just about this poem and Mr. S. And Rachel, your question about not, how do we write about other people and what does that mean? And it was deeply gratifying to me. I showed him this poem. I wanted him to see it, and he read it, and we talked about it, and I said to him, I don't remember my words exactly, but something like, you took these flowers back to yourself. Your creativity, your ingenuity, your insistence and your passion, you triumphed here. And he hadn't quite seen himself that way. Of course he knew what he did, but it was in the doing. There's a way in which we experience, and then there's a way in which we reflect on what we experience. And that's a poem, for those of us who write. That's part of how we reflect on our experience. But he'd never, he hadn't had a lot of opportunities to have his experience reflected back. And that made me very, very happy that he not only did the thing he did, but then he could have the thing he did and hold it in a special way. So, Alan, you just asked me something, and now I can't remember what you asked me because I was off on that.
No,
But
you
I
said
was just wanting to say that.
You said something very illuminating, and I think it leads back to what I
Oh,
was
the
saying.
endings. Yes,
Yeah,
the ending.
but in a way, a lot of these kind of images, I mean, James Wright and Robert Bly called them deep image when they were trying to find a way to pull out of the starkness of confessional poetry. And you worked with Sexton, so you know a little bit of what that is like. Some of that is artifice, but a lot of it isn't. There's more artifice in a deep image poem, but it's the kind of artifice where, in this case, I think you saw something happening in real time that you associated, maybe unconsciously, but still, it had wider resonance.
Oh,
And
yes.
so, and
You can't help it.
It becomes, and I think this is something that's deeply true in Bishop. We talked a little bit about Elizabeth Bishop before we started, of seeing something very closely and very clearly, that the more you describe it at the literal level becomes a metonym for something else, which is much bigger and much more intense. And so an audience hearing the poem, or readers reading the poem, have a moment of sort of mental refreshment. That's where people in poetry readings make what Robert Pinsky called the poetry noise. Ah,
right.
The
poetry
at the end. And I had to refrain myself from doing that while you're reading it. But that's, there's Mark Strand's poem, Eating Poetry. And in a sense, the flowers take on that kind of resonance in the poem. This is somebody who's eating the very substance of the mystic materials that start out as physical, but then are transformed.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, that's a beautiful thing to say about it. Thank you. Yes, I think that the more we observe in detail and describe, the more we are talking about, the more that we can convey the feeling that is there. That this is something that I talk about a lot when I'm teaching, that detail and description is actually the most reliable vehicle for delivering emotion. And for people who aren't writers, they might think, oh, well, if you want to raise the emotion, if you want to convey the emotion, you could just talk about it directly and say, this is what I'm feeling, or this is what this was all about. But really, it's through that detail and description, because we're trying to create that feeling in the reader. And to do that, we have to put the reader there. The reader has to have a chance to get into that room and see what I was able to see in the room. And the closer in, I sometimes also talk about to students, your camera is not bolted to the ground. You can move it in, you can move it out. And so as you move it in closer and closer, we can see in more and more detail, and often things become more fascinating, just the way they do if we look through a microscope and we, like there might be a little tiny insect on your window and it just looks like a little dot. But if you look at it through a microscope, you just mesmerized, because you see all the detail of this little creature that otherwise just looks like a dot.
But there's something that's not literal that happens in the ending. The mouth is frothing. I mean, it's literal, but it's more.
Yes. I can tell you a little bit about that too. It was a longer poem, as many of my poems often are, as they get started. And even sometimes when I publish them too soon in a magazine. But originally I had a metaphor in there that Mr. S was grazing in that meadow of flowers, almost like a horse, maybe one of the horses that his ancestors rode. And so I kind of was sort of going off on that metaphor, on that image, and it was just too much. I mean, he doesn't have to be a horse in that poem. He can just be himself. But I think that often when there's something in a poem that we take out, that the trace of that remains, the resonance of it remains. And so I do think that there's a way in which we almost do see him grazing, even though it's not explicit anymore.
Well, the image of frothing is what's so powerful, because the frothing at the mouth is also associated with madness, associated with death. And because of that verb, so many new associations jump into the poem. Yeah. And that's what I meant about the endings, because the poem is like the widening of the camera angle. It just zooms out.
Thank you. And yes, he this was a kind of, what do they call it? Crazy wisdom. In again, in Europa, I think they call it crazy wisdom. Yes. So he was doing something that was, on the one hand, pretty crazy, but on the other hand, when you, or maybe you shouldn't say one hand and the other. On the surface, perhaps pretty crazy, but deep down, very, very wise.
So this sort of epiphanic moment in the poem, you don't always end the same way. I mean, you have many strategies at the ends of your poem, mm-hmm. But often there's an experience of how did you put it, Rachel? Surprise?
Yes, the element of surprise. I think that's something that I feel like I encounter a lot when reading your poems. So do you like to surprise your readers, and how do you go about creating those elements of surprise, whether at the line level or stanza breaks or even just a shifting in tone? So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, Stephen Dobbins in his book, Best Words, Best Order, says that the ending of a poem has to be both unpredictable and I'm saying it wrong. Has to be both inevitable and surprising. Inevitable and surprising. And one time I had a student say to me, did you say inevitable and surprising, or inevitable or surprising? And it was like, oh, if only you only had to get one, but no, you have to get them both. So we do need surprise. Poems become boring if we're not surprised. We want to be surprised at least a little bit all the way through. Sometimes you read a poem that is competently written in some ways, but you know what the poem's going to say, you know where it's going to go, and it just sort of does the thing it's doing and gets there. And usually you don't adore that poem. Usually that poem, isn't one that you hold in your heart and return to again and again. So yes, and the surprise is really about surprising myself, because if I knew what I was going to say, I wouldn't need to write it. It's the process of writing the poem and discovering things that I didn't know before is why I do it. There would be nothing else that would be worth the amount of work it takes me. And some poets are more facile at writing. I'm not. I have to work a lot and very hard. And there isn't any outer acknowledgement or recognition that would be enough to justify that for me. What it's really about is the experience of writing the poem and surprising myself and finding out what I didn't know before.
And so do you start with a boring poem? Like if you write a boring poem, do you then think, I need to put something in here? Or does the surprise come when you're doing that process of writing the poem for the first time?
I have, unfortunately, maybe for me, I don't have a process that's predictable. So sometimes when I write a poem and I use a certain process, I think, oh, good, now I could try this again on this other poem. And it's usually hopeless. Each thing, it seems I can almost only use once. And so every poem is different. Some poems are a kind of long process of gathering and writing a lot and having no idea where they're going. Other poems seem to come out in a whoosh, and then maybe I have almost all of it there, and it's just a question of really whittling it down to what the poem needs. And I have one poem in this book, ironically called Failure, that it took me 12 years to write, and every few years I'd give it another go because the incident in the poem continued to be of interest to me. But each time I wrote it and worked on it a lot, ultimately it was like, no, this is not making it. I still haven't gotten to it. And then after doing this, 4 or 5 times, with a few years in between, really working on it each time, finally, it was like I could knock on that door and it would open.
I was going to just say we have maybe time for a couple more questions, but along that sense of your process and where poems come from for you, especially while you are going through the life episodes that you explain while writing Indigo. Do you find sometimes that the language itself or the syntax is generative, and that
absolutely
knowing what you're going to write about, just completing from subject to predicate, you suddenly discover where the poem is?
Absolutely. The language is one of the most reliable forces that moves the poem forward for me. And when I feel that the language, the syntax, sometimes the diction, sometimes the metaphor, once that language starts to move, if I can stay with that groove, usually I'm going to be in some territory that's fertile for me in some way.
So could you point to a poem, maybe in Indigo, we can maybe wrap up with, that you can read a little bit from and talk about what the language was doing, and for you, how that helped generate the poem?
Well, let me read this one. I'm not sure it exactly answers your question, but it is so much about language, and it is one that I worked with in terms of language a lot. And it's called, it's a not too long a poem, so I could read the whole thing. It's called The Small Country, and it was generated through thinking about words that are not easily translated from one language to another. So I really started out thinking about language literally. And then as you see it, it kind of opens up. The Small Country. Unique, I think, is the Scottish tartle. That hesitation when introducing someone whose name you've forgotten. And what could capture cafuné, the Brazilian Portuguese way to say running your fingers tenderly through someone's hair? Is there a term in any tongue for choosing to be happy? And where is speech for the block of ice we pack in the sawdust of our hearts? What appellation approaches the smell of apricots thickening the air when you boil jam in early summer? What words reach the way I touched you last night, as though I had never known a woman, an explorer, wholly curious to discover each particular fold and hollow, without guide, not even the mirror of my own body. Last night, you told me you liked my eyebrows. You said you never really noticed them before. What is the word that fuses this freshness with the pity of having missed it? And how even touch itself cannot mean the same to both of us, even in this small country of our bed, even in this language with only 2 native speakers.
Yeah, that's a beautiful poem. And yet we could see a pattern of rhetorical questions that you seem to be creating and answering. Did you say a little bit more about how the syntax and the pattern was working for you?
Yes, I did not have any idea when I started this poem that it would be a love poem. I was just really fascinated by this list that I had bumped into online. You know, I do a lot of online researching, and I love going down those rabbit holes of finding out about things that I didn't know about. And I think that while I am doing that, my less conscious mind is chewing around the poem. And so I don't think of it as a waste of time at all. I think of it as a way both to learn things, but also to give my mind a chance to work without me watching it. And so I just was thinking about this as a poem about language. And then I got, I had many pages of many words that in the early drafts of this poem, translation in general and communication in general. But I think the real turn for me came really early. Is there a term in any tongue for choosing to be happy? And that's when the poem for me opened up. And the joy of this poem in the writing it was allowing these leaps to happen. And that's always exciting when I leap from one thing to another that I didn't expect to leap to, didn't intend to have happen.
That's great. That's a good place for us to stop. I want to thank Rachel Crawford for interviewing Ellen Bass with me. My name is Alan Soldofsky. We've been assisted by Michael Todd Edgerton, who's working the controls. And we are celebrating the legacy of poetry at San Jose State University. Our theme is Staying Home, the Way to San Jose. And next year, Ellen will find the way to San Jose because she will be our Lurie Distinguished Visiting Author in Residence. Ellen Bass, thank you so much for
Oh, this has been my pleasure. The last thing I have to do, I have to show you this gorgeous cover of my book. And I think that this book is, if there were prizes for most beautiful book, not like the best poetry, but the most beautiful book, I think that this one would win the prize.
Well, there is a book cover prize. Tell Copper Canyon to enter it. And
oh, good.
Speaking of Copper Canyon, a wonderful poetry publishing house based in Port Townsend, Washington, like everybody else, locked down during the coronavirus shelter-in-place emergency. They have a great website, and if you're not near an indie bookstore that happens to take online orders, you can go to the Copper Canyon Press website, click on Ellen Bass, you'll find Indigo, and at the bottom of the page, well, there's a poem of hers called Marriage that you might want to read as you scroll down, and that's from Indigo. And then you can get yourself or get your friends copies of Indigo by clicking on the links there. Ellen Bass, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
I think we